Oh, you ain't got to read that.
Allens Investigate, airing live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 FM in New Orleans. Yay, and welcome to the Allens Investigate with me, Shona Allen.
And I'm Gary Allen, the Cockney Bard.
We're broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 and 107.7 FM from New Orleans, and now on Roku. Well, tonight we're going to be talking about Shakespeare and hoping to solve a mystery. Shakespeare, born Gulielmus Filius Johannes Shakespeare on the 23rd of April 1564 and married Anne Hathaway in November 1582, had a daughter Susanna and twins Hamlet and Judith. At some point made his way to London, became a member of London's leading theatre company, wrote plays and became a shareholder in the Globe Theatre. The grant of arms was successfully gained in 1596 and he purchased the second biggest house in Stratford, New Place. He died on the 23rd of April 1616 after a drinking session with fellow playwright Michael Drayton and Ben Jonson, died of a fever. Famous for 36 plays in 1623 First Folio, entitled Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories and Tragedies, and a collection of 154 sonnets from 1609 entitled Shake-Speare's Sonnets. According to history, he was a literary genius. Now, from historical records, we learn the following. He was a very naughty boy.
A very naughty boy.
Now, don't for 1 minute think this is a hatchet job on the great bard. We look at all the evidence and in the end come to a conclusion.
We do indeed. Right, let's have a look, shall we, and see what we can find, how he's been a naughty boy. Right, in 1596, according to the Michaelmas court record, William Waite swore before the judge of Queen's Bench that he stood in danger of death or bodily hurt from William Shakespeare and 3 others. The magistrate then commanded the sheriff of the appropriate county to produce the accused, who had to post bond to keep the peace on pain of forfeiting the security. Now, that's an interesting one, isn't it? You don't very often hear that, do you?
No, we don't.
Let's have a look, see where we're going now. 1597, a tax record, Shakespeare named in the King's Remembrancer subsidy roll as a tax defaulter in Bishopgate Ward, who failed to pay and assessed 5 shillings. Yes, okay. 1598, the February the 4th, Shakespeare named as having illegally hoarding 10 quarters, 8 bushels of malt or corn during a shortage. That's so from the Shakespeare birthday. Hoarding grain. Can you believe it? That's Shakespeare. Very naughty boy. 1598, 10th of January, in the King's Remembrancer subsidy roll, Shakespeare is listed in a tax defaulter who failed to pay and assessed 13 shillings and 4d. Goodness me. Yes, so I think we can take it from that. And then was a little bit more here. 1599, Shakespeare listed in the Lord Treasurer's Remembrancer, Residerum London accounts as delinquents owing back taxes. Very naughty boy.
Well, now that we understand a little bit of Shakespeare's character, perhaps we can have a look at why some doubt that Shakespeare actually wrote the works attributed to him. Numerous books have been written on the Shakespeare authorship question. So who are the main candidates? Let's have a look. So Christopher Marlowe is the first one. And these people that support this authorship debate for Marlowe are called Marlovians.
Marlovians, indeed. Marlovians. Well, Christopher Marlowe, let's have a look at Christopher Marlowe. Now, there was a chap called Hoffman, Calvin Hoffman, who spoke up vociferously for Christopher Marlowe. Well, Marlowe was a poet and a dramatist of great merit. He went to Cambridge, as educated in Cambridge. He's considered a great playwright with successful plays to his name, including The Jew of Malta, Dr. Faustus, Queen of Carthage, Edward II, other works including Tamburlaine. He's renowned for his translation of Ovid. He has an interest in the occult. Yes, indeed. And some conclude Marlowe wrote, like Shakespeare, parallelisms exist in some of the works. So, yeah, that's a little bit about Marlowe. Also, we find that Marlowe is attributed as collaborating with Shakespeare on the 3 Henry VI plays.
So interesting.
Yes, but there is a problem with that, in the fact he was killed in 1593.
Okay.
And, well, yes, he's supposed to be killed in a fight. And apparently, you know, I don't think you can write once you're dead. This is a bit of a problem. But
unless you're doing it for the spirit world, no.
But perhaps, well, just perhaps he faked his own death. What about that?
Well, that's possible.
Because he was involved in a secret service, so that's quite possible, isn't it?
Okay.
So that may have happened. But anyway, well, we also find that Shakespeare is mentioned not only in the eulogies and praise, but alongside Marlowe in Meres' Paladis Tamia Allusions, 1598, as among the best for tragedy. So therefore, if they're both mentioned in the same place, it's highly unlikely that is Marlowe. But it is quite interesting that they made a film, didn't they, called Anonymous, which was based on Christopher Marlowe as being Shakespeare.
Was it Christopher Marlowe? Was that the Earl of Oxford, De Vere?
No, it was Marlowe.
Was it?
Yeah, it was Marlowe. Because remember, we met that lady, didn't we? She got paid £100,000.
Right, but she believed it was De Vere, though.
No,
So
was that right?
Yes.
Okay, I might have that wrong then. Anyway, okay, so yes, let's have a look then.
Okay, so the next candidate to look at is Sir Francis Bacon.
Ah, right. Okay, these are known as Baconians.
Yes, and he's quite a popular candidate with men.
Well,
as well.
he's very, very popular indeed. Yes, he's very popular indeed. Bacon wrote something called a promise from 1594 to 1996. Sorry, notes and various jottings in many languages, including English, Latin, Italian, Greek, Spanish, and French, and many of these appear in the plays of Shakespeare, which is very, very interesting, isn't it? You know, also in the promise there was let me have a look. Yeah, it says here that he wished to introduce salutations into English speech. Notes made in the promise in 1596. It's a remarkable coincidence that the following year, 1597, in the play Romeo and Juliet was published, containing some of these salutations, and they afterwards appear in other Shakespeare plays, good morrow being used 115 times, good day 15 times, and good soir even 12 times. These words are found in the Shakespeare plays and nowhere else, which is quite interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
We also find that there is a double A symbol. Bacon produced and published a number of literary works and used a light A and a dark A emblematics headpiece to mark various works which he produced. The Shakespeare plays were marked with this emblematic headpiece. There were a number of the first edition of Lucretia, the sonnets, quarter editions of Shakespeare, Shakespeare's First Folio, 1623, and the Bible, even King James Version.
Which is interesting, isn't it?
It is very interesting, yeah. We find that Bacon was Cambridge educated. Bacon was well learned, had a great mind, interest in and knowledge of the occult, links to those of the Literary Society. There is a suggestion he was a concealed poet. The Northumberland manuscript, where the names of Bacon and Shakespeare are written on the same sheet. That's very, very interesting. Yeah. According to Peter Dawkins, who is a Baconian researcher, Francis Bacon is identified as the author of the Shakespeare poems Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucretia, in an exchange of satires between Joseph Hall and John Marston, published between 1597 and 1598. So that's interesting. And there's also Mainz Verulamiani, yes, which is 30.
Tongue twister.
Well, it is a tongue twister for Cockney. 32 allegories written on the death of Francis Bacon by colleagues of Cambridge and Oxford. So in 1626. So he was very, very respected,
Yes,
Francis
he was.
Bacon. Yes, a great mind. And there's also, now this is quite interesting. There's also a letter from a guy called John Davis, and it's addressed to the Royal, if you don't mind, ingenious and all-learned knight, Sir Francis Bacon. And that's from the Scourge of Folly, 1610.
Which is interesting, isn't it? Because I've heard this before and seen a fair bit of evidence actually pointing towards the fact that Francis Bacon was actually the sort of product of her liaison, shall we say, with Leicester, wasn't it?
I beg your pardon. Are you trying to say that Queen Elizabeth I isn't a virgin? What on earth are you on about?
Well, she was virgin in name. Virgin is something. But...
Oh my God!
Yeah.
Well, this is a real shocker. Are you sure about that?
Yeah,
Huh?
I have seen a fair bit, but it's a bit.
Well, that could change history. If that's true, that could change history, couldn't it?
But if people decide to go and have a look for themselves, they might find some interesting, intriguing bits of information.
Yes, but that's quite interesting. And you remember when we took that visit to the church at St Albans?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
And there was a painting there, wasn't there, with a bit of purple on it or something? And
there were some ecumenical symbols, and one of them was a bit out of place, I believe. Wasn't
yes, and he did say something about royal on that, didn't he, as well? So that's very interesting. And there's something else that I find very interesting. That Bacon wrote an essay on gardens, and he features 35 flowers that Shakespeare mentioned 32 of them. So that's interesting as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So, and there's also something about Alfred Dodd claims that a cipher proves the Shakespeare sonnets were written by Bacon, but I'm not entirely convinced by that. I've got to be honest. I'm not. No, I'm not. I'm not entirely convinced by that. But nevertheless, I'm open to persuasion, but I'm not convinced that Bacon wrote the sonnets. But anyway, yeah. So this is about Bacon, and Bacon wasn't known as a playwright or a poet, and he's not mentioned at all in Mere's Paladis Tabia Allusions.
These are against the argument, aren't they?
Well, yeah, they are, but
some problematic things.
Well, they're only little things. They're only little things, aren't they, really? But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, there are parallelisms between the candidates, but they could be plagiarized words, passages, lines put in often, and I don't know. I mean, I read a piece, The Life of Man by Sir Francis Bacon. The world's a bubble, and life of man less than a span. In his conception, wretched from the womb, so to the tomb, cursed from the cradle, and brought up into years with cares and fears. Who then to frail mortality shall trust? I don't know. That doesn't sound to me much like Shakespeare. I got to be honest, but it doesn't. It doesn't. No.
No. So that's quite interesting. So what about the Earl of Oxford then? Because he's another one that has been put forward, and I believe is the candidate in the film Anonymous.
Right. Yes. Okay. Now, the Earl of Oxford, he is an interesting Edward de Vere. Okay. He composed, directed and acted, managed his own acting troupe called the Oxford Boys, and was a leaseholder of Blackfriars Theatre, rival to the Globe. He was educated at Cambridge and had an extensive library from which to draw upon, knowledge of the courts. At court, de Vere was known as the spear shaker.
Oh, no, that's interesting.
Which excites a lot of people from that camp. Shakespeare's name is often hyphenated as Shakespeare-Spear. Shakespeare, he studied law, similarities between his life and Hamlet, wrote poems and sonnets, avid interest in the occult, which seems to be a lot of them. Of course,
he had the spear on his family crest, I believe, as well, didn't he?
Yeah. Okay. And Thomas Looney, he was a great advocate for the Earl of Oxford. He points to Lancastrian connections, a love of music, Italian things, sports, particularly falconry, which is in the Shakespeare,
because it's in Shakespeare.
And he wrote plays. Now there's always a downside, though, isn't there, to these things? When you're trying to prove something, but we can overlook it, I suppose. He died in 1604.
Right.
Oh, that is a bit of a problem, isn't it,
Yeah,
really?
because Shakespeare died in 1611.
1616, if you don't mind.
1616,
Yeah.
sorry.
He died in 1604 before many of the Shakespeare plays were composed. Dates of plays can be dubious, but this is compelling evidence against Oxford. De Vere also published under his own name. Mears Palladis Tamia, which is a good source of quoting from, Allusions, 1598, mentions the Earl of Oxford alongside Shakespeare as being best for comedy.
Interesting.
So,
and it's interesting, talking about De Vere publishing under his own name, because I know that it was quite common for the aristocracy to publish under pen names and that kind of thing. But the fact that he actually did publish under his own name is quite valid, I think.
And it's also he's mentioned as a writer of comedy in the same paragraph as Shakespeare.
He had a bit of a thing with the Queen, didn't he? A bit of a happening, did he not?
Well, I'm absolutely disgusted with it. I mean, apparently he broke wind in front of Her Majesty. You cannot do that. And apparently he was so embarrassed by it that he went travelling for 7 years.
I'm not surprised.
Oh,
we are not amused.
I'd have had his head off, really, for that. I mean, how can you do that in front of Elizabeth I? That's outrageous, isn't it?
Terrible.
Yeah, absolutely. And, well, anyway, yes, it's a bit vulgar, but there you go. Anyway, it's a matter of record, so we trust that's true. There's also another little fly in the ointment, and that's the will of Augustine Phillips. He died in May 1605, and he was Elizabethan actor who performed in troupes with Edward Allen and William Shakespeare. Now, he left a will where he bequests a 30-shilling gold piece each to Shakespeare, Henry Clondell, and Christopher Beeston. And the Earl of Oxford died in 1604. So that's a slight problem. Slight problem. Yeah, but anyway, maybe we can overcome that. Who knows? Okay. But if 30-shilling gold pieces left to Shakespeare,
would suggest that perhaps
yes,
not them.
No. And there's also another thing, which is 1610. John Davis of Hereford published a volume entitled The Scourge of Folly, consisting mostly of poems to famous people and Davis' friends. One of these poems was addressed to Shakespeare, to our English Terence, Mr. Will Shakespeare. Yes, but clearly by then Oxford had been dead for 6 years.
Right.
So, it's not looking too good for him. But nevertheless, there are many things in the works of Shakespeare that could lead you to think that the Earl of Oxford was the man.
There's some interesting things. And then, of course, there's William Stanley, the Earl of Derby, the 6th Earl of Derby.
6th Earl of Derby, yes.
Another candidate.
Yes, another interesting candidate. Now, he penned comedies for common players, had his own troupe of players, the Derby's Men, or Derby's Men, whatever you want to call it, played frequently before the court, educated at St John's College, Oxford. Derby's brother's troupe was Lord Strange's Men, had been one of the most prominent acting companies at court and on tour in the early 1590s. His brother-in-laws were the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery, dedicatees of the Shakespeare First Folio 1623.
Which is interesting.
It is interesting, yes. His brother, Ferdinando, the 5th Earl of Derby, was heavily into the occult, a lover of the arts, theatre, and patron to many writers, including Robert Greene, Marlowe, and Shakespeare. Now, so there was
a connection.
Oh yes, there's a connection. There's a connection so far with all of them. Bacon, Earl of Derby. There's a lot. And the thing is that no works of Stanley survive, unfortunately. No plays, poems, or sonnets. He lived well beyond the First Folio of Shakespeare 1623 and died in 1642.
Right, which again is slightly problematic.
Well, it's problematic because it's quite a few years after Shakespeare was dead and buried, so that is a problem. And he was still alive. Praise of the long-time dead Shakespeare 1616 by other authors and playwrights would suggest Stanley could not have been the author Shakespeare. So I think that's a fair point, really, don't you?
Yeah, definitely.
And Stanley is not mentioned among the best poets or playwrights in Mears Palladis Tamia Allusions 1598, whereas Shakespeare is. So that's interesting, isn't it?
That's interesting.
Again, parallelisms between the candidates could merely be plagiarized words, passages, or lines. So that's very interesting.
Okay, well, obviously, William Shakespeare, and these are known as Stratfordians, so let's look at his case then.
As a candidate, yes, all right, okay. There's quite a lot on this man. His name is on the first. His name is on the First Folio of 1623, which is a quite obvious one. His name is on various plays published before the First Folio of 1623. His name is on sonnets published in 1609 by Thomas Fulk. The eulogies and praise he received from those such as Ben Jonson, Hayward, Bass, Digges, Holland, Davis, and others is quite impressive. Yeah. Now I've got to say this right.
Okay.
I say because if I get this wrong, it could be a problem. In the year of 1615, Edmund Howes published a list in Our Modern and Present Excellent Poets in John Stow's
Annals. Yes, I'm glad you got that.
Annals. Annunciation not so good for the Cockney Bard. According to their priority social rank, as near as I could, knights were listed first, followed thereafter by gentlemen. In the middle of the 27 listed, number 13 is M. Willie Shakespeare, gentleman. So that's very interesting. Yeah. That's very interesting. There is evidence he was an actor, performed in his own plays, and had shares in the Globe. He's mentioned in Mears, Paladis, Tamia Illusions, 1598, as many are, as being among the best for poetry, comedy, and tragedy. Yes. Okay. Now, do we have any problems with this man, Shakespeare?
I think probably quite a few, actually.
Well, let's start with when he died, shall we? So we'll say his will. Now,
well, yeah, I mean his will is he left his wife his second best bed, didn't he?
When I say will, I don't want to get this confused for people.
Will, not wheel.
Will, not will.
Because
will.
Londoners tend to pronounce it the same way. Will
and will. Will. Yeah, they all sound the same, but anyway.
For clarification, will.
Yes, he's deaf, will. And no manuscripts, however, no plays.
No poetry, no unpublished plays, or no intellectual property of any kind, which I think is a little unusual, to say the least. His parents, I believe, were illiterate, as were his offspring, also illiterate. I think that was it Susanna? I think barely scrawl her name. So I find that rather unusual that you've got somebody who he did allegedly go to the grammar school for a short while, and in that short while suddenly writing and inventing language. I do find that a bit strange.
Well, it's difficult to understand.
I think as well that, had you have been so learned and so great a wit in literature, I think that you probably would want to pass that on in some way to your children.
That's just a minor thing. However, he did leave his second best bed to his wife, which was most generous. Yep. And I think, that's probably an ideal gift to leave.
Are you going to do that for me?
Probably. So anyway, we would go on when we say there was a lot of collaboration on plays, etc. It was commonplace in those days. And the extent of his vocabulary is said to be far greater than any other writer. It is said all his plays produced around 15,000 words, twice as many as Milton. I mean, so if he wasn't very learned, that's quite a difficult problem to get round, doesn't it? It does. And also, it's said that Shakespeare was familiar with 7 foreign languages and quoted them directly in the plays. The composition of 36 plays, minimum 154 sonnets, over 30 different subjects, from law to flowers.
Mm.
There's some Freemasonry in it. There's all kinds of stuff. You know, law,
I think as well. It's
court
quite,
matters.
I was going to say there was things like falconry and lawn bowling and various things that would be relevant to somebody who's an aristocrat and who is at court, not somebody who's a bit sort of lower to middle class at the time. So I find that also rather unusual. Going to the literary side as well. I mean, having looked at and studied his surviving alleged signatures, it looks like a person who could barely write or was extremely drunk at the time when he was writing them.
Yeah, and they're all different, aren't they?
And
The
they're
6
all slightly
signatures.
different,
Yeah, so there are questions. There are questions around that, and and also
someone who's a literary genius and who's writing lots of manuscripts, I do find it a little difficult to get my head around the fact that these signatures are like a spider's crawled across the page.
yeah, it's a bit difficult to understand, and also there's a lot of criticism of Shakespeare, isn't there, from certain parties?
Yes, which is interesting.
Yeah, so on Poet Ape of Ben Jonson,
Yes.
Jonson's criticism in his Timbers and Discoveries, Robert Greene's Goat's Worth of Wit reference to an upstart crow, and George Sandy's comment of Shakespeare that he had little learning, you know, so they are interesting.
Yeah, Ben Jonson's what was interested. I think that was the Book of Epigrams, 1616, on the year of Shakespeare's death. Did he call him a poet ape?
A poet ape, yes. I'm going to have a look at that in a minute. And also, Joseph Hall's satires refer to Shakespeare's labio, which was used as a ridicule and as a plagiarist who stole from Petrarch. So, you know, that's to do with the sonnets. That's very interesting. And of course, then you've got the dishonest past, which no one ever tells you about. But anyway, it is there.
I've got a question as well from Kevin, and it says, why do you think there are different spellings of words? Was it because English wasn't standardised by then?
I think so.
Yes,
yeah.
I believe so, that it wasn't standardised. I mean, this person called Shakespeare is supposed to have invented much
600 or more words
even
invented.
His own name, if it was indeed the same person, is spelled many different ways.
Yeah, Shakespeare and
Shakespeare. Yeah, so that's quite
interesting. It is very interesting, and you know, as I say, the dishonest past meant that he was more than capable of brokering plays, buying and selling plays, or it's not beyond question plagiarizing to achieve his own fame, as Jonson, Hall and Green have claimed. So that's very, very interesting.
Well, I think when you look at his past dealings, I think didn't he poach deer from Charlecote Park from Lucy as well?
Well, I don't know, but I think I did read that somewhere, that he had stolen some deer.
Yes, I mean, I think it wasn't beyond the realms of possibility that he was doing naughty things in order to get money. Yeah,
I think so. You know, he was talking about on Poet Ape. That was from Ben Jonson, and he basically says, "Poor Poet Ape, that would be thought our chief, whose works are even the frippery of wit, from brokerages become so bold a thief, as we, the robbed, leave rage and pity it." And you see, I think he said, and basically at the end of it, he says, "Fall as if half eyes will not know a fleece from locks of wool, or shreds from the whole piece." And I think basically he's saying that, you know, we know what you're up to and everything. So that's very interesting. Yeah. And then also from Ben Jonson, it's another thing from Ben Jonson which is interesting, and it's the very famous memory of our beloved, the author William Shakespeare, from the 1623 First Folio. And what stood out to me in it was the truth but gropes, and urgeth all by chance, or crafty malice might pretend this praise, and think to ruin where it seemed to raise. So he's praising him in one and destroying him in the other. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah.
And though thou hadst small Latin and less Greek, and for a poet's made as well as born. So I picked them lines out. I thought they were very, very interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned about Robert Greene as well, because he was from Norwich, interestingly, which is obviously not far from us. He was an English prose writer who obtained a degree at both Cambridge and Oxford.
Yeah,
and he
was very bright.
describes Shakespeare as an upstart crow.
Oh,
and a
yes.
Johannes Factotum, which means jack of all trades.
Yeah, a master of none. I would think that's what that basically means, isn't it? So I mean, Green is a very, very interesting character. But apparently, when he died, Chettle, I think it was Henry Chettle, apologized to Shakespeare for his insult, for Green's insult.
Okay.
But it's a bit dodgy that anyway.
Yeah.
In Johnson's Every Man and His Humour, you remember you had that dream and you saw Shakespeare as a clown, didn't you? Do you remember that?
Picture,
Yeah,
a clown's face.
As a clown face. Well, there's a character called Sogliardo, and he's described as an essential clown. And he just acquired a coat of arms, which is what Shakespeare had done. And following the conversation ensues between Sogliardo and Punter Volo, the Herald's office gave him a coat of arms, on which he was very proud. So that does.
I think it says on there "non sans droit," which means not without.
Yeah,
right,
not without right. Yeah, that is interesting, isn't it? That is very, very interesting.
And then you've got Leonard Digges as well. It's an interesting.
Leonard Digges is he's a very, very interesting character because he was esteemed by those who knew him in University College, a great master of the English language, a perfect understander of the French and Spanish, a good poet and no mean orator. So he's a very, very interesting character because he's the son of Thomas Digges, and Thomas Digges was a mathematician and astronomer who was close friends with Dr. John Dee.
Yeah, which is the astronomer or astrologer and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I.
Yeah,
so that's quite interesting.
That is interesting, and there's a eulogy from Shakespeare's poems that was published by John Benson in 1640.
John Benson, so that's like
it's a reverse of Ben Jonson. Yeah, it is, and he says that poets are born, not made, which is a reverse of what Johnson said, because Johnson said that poets are made, not born. This is an interesting thing. I can't get my head around this, but it's very, very interesting. He says in it, this whole book thou shalt find he doth not borrow, this is talking about Shakespeare, one phrase from Greeks, nor Latins imitate, nor once from vulgar languages translate, nor plagiarize like others from others glean, not begs he from each witty friend a scene, to pieces acts withal, all that he doth write is pure his own, plot, language exquisite. Now, that's very interesting because for someone who was as bright as Leonard Digges, it's quite clear that some of the plots of Shakespeare came from Bandello and the Italian playwrights and everything. And, and others are saying, well, he plagiarized things, so it doesn't seem to make sense. Something's not adding up there.
So do you think perhaps he's alluding to somebody who was receiving the information direct from a source, shall we say, the muses?
Well, I don't know whether that was Shakespeare, but anyway, he goes.
Alternatively, he could just be taking the mickey.
Well, exactly. But what is interesting, he goes on to say, but why do I dead Shakespeare's praise recite? Some second Shakespeare must of Shakespeare write. For me 'tis needless, since an host of men will pay to clap his praise to free my pen. Now that is very, very interesting.
So it is alluding to somebody else then, isn't it?
It's alluding to somebody else as a pen, yes. Yes, very, very interesting. So we then where are we up to now? So
I think you were going to mention the Passionate Pilgrim.
Yes. Yes. The Passionate Pilgrim. Now this is a very, very interesting set of poems published in 1599 under the name of Shakespeare. Now it is thought that only 5 of the 20 poems are from Shakespeare. Right? One of the poems, Sonnet 138, as published in the 1609 Shakespeare Sonnets. The question is, why was this one particular line changed? In the first book, it says, unskillful in the world's false forgeries. And it was changed to unlearned in the world's false subtleties. So the implication of being an unskilled forger. So that's really
Which sounds a
interesting.
bit like the man from Stratford, doesn't it?
Well, I wouldn't like to call him a forger. You don't want to get sued, you know. We don't know. But anyway, the Passionate Pilgrim includes later published When My Love Swears That She Is Made of Truth, Sonnet 138. Two Loves I Have of Comfort and Despair, which I'll go on to in a little while, which is phenomenal. Sonnet 144. Did not the heavenly rhetoric of thine eye Longueville's Sonnet to Maria in Love's Labours Lost? If love make me forsworn, how shall I swear to love? Burran's or a sonnet to Rosalind in Love's Labours Lost. Yeah, it's interesting. And there's one poem which I do love, and I know you love that, and that's The Passionate Shepherd to His Love by Christopher Marlowe. Well, that's in the Shakespeare poems, you know. And I find that quite extraordinary. So what you've got the poems of Shakespeare, that only 5 of them could be attributed to Shakespeare anyway. So what about the other 15?
Well,
and why is it under the name of Shakespeare?
Why indeed?
Interesting stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, and then we have a look at, let's have a look at the Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark. Now, this is very, very interesting, and I can't get round this, right? Now, I have to read this because it's from the first quarto, 1603, right? And this is Hamlet, and it's the most famous one of all, I think. To be or not to be? Aye, there's the point. To die, to sleep, is that all? Aye, all. No, to sleep, to dream. Aye, Mary, there it goes. For in that dream of death when we awake, and born before an everlasting judge, from whence no passenger ever returned, the undiscovered country, at whose sight the happy smile and the accursed damned. But for this, the joyful hope of this, who would bear the scorns and flattery of the world, scorned by the right rich, the rich cursed, or the poor, the widow being oppressed. Anyway, that is it. That is,
which is very different to the one that we have now.
And then you have in 1623, we have this one. To be or not to be? That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of troubles and by opposing end them. To die, to sleep no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. I won't go on with that, but it's a typical example.
Very different though, isn't it? From
that is perfection, and the other one is quite dire, really. I mean, I don't claim to be a Shakespearean expert, but what I do know, I know what a quality piece of poetry is, and I'm afraid that quarto, the first one of Hamlet, it
certainly raises some questions.
It raises a lot of questions, yes, indeed, yeah.
So if we move on then to the First Folio of 1623, and the engraving of Joitzolt appears very odd.
Yeah, the Joitzolt engraving of 1623, the very imperfect portrait. It looks like a large head on a shield, or
a dish.
Or a dish, exactly. It does. It's very, very weird. And what's even stranger is that the poems of Shakespeare from 1640 have the engraving on, and it's in reverse. So that's also interesting. That's worth looking at. You know, looking at the two and comparing the two. Definitely. But I'm sure there's a definite message in that engraving for sure. And I think he's got a sprig of. I can't think what a sprig is of, but I know it's sort of Freemasonic or something. Anyway, it's interesting stuff.
Interesting things with that.
Yeah, indeed.
So, what are we to make of the name Shakespeare, at times spelt with a hyphen between shake and spear? Now, some claim it comes from the spear shaker, the Greek Pallas Athena, goddess of wisdom, which may be the case. But there are also some interesting alternatives. Yeah,
well, I read a couple of books. One's by Francis Roos and Zachary Bogan. And what's interesting about that, it talks about the shake with the hyphen spear, sorry. And it said a Shakespeare came at length to be an ordinary word both in Homer, which is interesting because that links to George Chapman, and other poets to signify a soldier, which is interesting.
Okay.
And another thing I found was in a book called by Thomas Bancroft. I think it's 1639, and it's epigrams and epitaphs. And at 118, it says to Shakespeare, "Thy muse's sugar dainties seem to us like the famed apples of old Tantalus. For we admire and see and hear thy strains, but none I see or hear those sweet attains." And at 119, which is to the same, to Shakespeare, it says, "Thou hast so used thy pen or shook thy spear, that poets startle, nor thy wit come near." And that is fascinating. Yeah, that is fascinating. So where are we at now?
So it says, when Michael Drayton is attributed to have written one of the most famous speeches of Shakespeare from King Richard II.
Oh, yes. I come across this as well. It's in it's in a book. Where are we? Let's have a quick look. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it says, "The world's a theatre, the earth a stage, which God and nature doth with actors fill. Kings have their entrance in due epicard, and some say parts are played well and others ill." And anyway, basically, that is. Oh, sorry, where am I? No, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong thing. It's Robert Albert, sorry, from 1600, of Albion. "This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, the earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, the other Eden, this demi-paradise." And that is attributed to Michael Drayton, okay, which is very, very interesting.
Okay.
And that the same one comes from William Shakespeare, King Richard II, Act 2, Scene 1.
Wow, that's interesting.
It is interesting, yeah, definitely. So
yes, and also going on to the bust at Stratford, because in the Holy Trinity Church in Stratford upon Avon, the bust that we know of now, as we understand it, was slightly different at one point, wasn't it?
It's changed so much. It really has. But it's quite interesting because, coming from living in Norwich and that, the one we see now has obviously got Shakespeare with his hands on a sack of grain or wool.
No, the one we know now of is
with a quill on parchment.
Yes, exactly.
but quite clearly. But going back to 16, but there was one where Shakespeare had his hands on a bag of grain or a bag of wool, something like that.
Which is interesting, bearing in mind his grain dealings, which we mentioned earlier on.
Yeah, but what is interesting is that there was a guy from the military company of Norwich was travelling through the English countryside, one Lieutenant Hammond, and he kept a diary. And on or about September the 9th, he made the following entry. "In that day's travel, we came by Stratford upon Avon, where in the church in that town there are some monuments, which church was built by Archbishop Stratford. Those worth observing, and of which we took notice, were these: a neat monument of that famous English poet, Mr. William Shakespeare, who was born here, and one of an old gentleman, a bachelor, Mr. Combe, upon whose name the said poet did merrily fan up some witty and facetious verses, which time would not give us leave to sack up." So he was writing 11 years after the First Folio and 12 to 18 years after the erection of the monument, and explicitly says that the monument is for that famous English poet, Mr. William Shakespeare, who was born here. So that does link Shakespeare, there's no question. So those who rule Shakespeare out and say, well, it does link Stratford upon Avon to to the famous poet, doesn't it?
It does.
So that's it's a very, very interesting, very, very interesting piece. That.
So perhaps if we take a look at two of the most important sonnets in uncovering the works of Shakespeare.
Where are we?
Sonnet 86 and Sonnet 144.
Yeah, where are you now? Okay. Which page is that? Yeah, okay. I think I've just gone past that actually, but anyway. Let's have a look. Okay. I don't know where that is now, actually.
Well, we can move on.
Move on, and I'll come back to that.
What about the touching on the shepherds? Because the Queen Elizabeth was known as the Queen of Shepherds, which is quite interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, because the shepherds, the poets. Yeah, and that all links to the. Let me see if I can find that. It's strange. It's got no number on that now. No, I'll go back. There we are. There we are now. Okay, got this right. Now, what were we talking about? We were talking about the Sonnet 86, weren't we?
Sonnet 86.
Sonnet 86 of Shakespeare. Now, what I find absolutely fascinating with this is the section where it says, "Was it his spirit, by spirits taught to write above a mortal pitch, that struck me dead? No, neither he nor his compeers by night giving him aid, my verse astonished. He nor the affable familiar ghost, which nightly goes in with intelligence." Now that George Chapman believed he had the spirit of Homer writing through him. That also links to me, because I have channeled many poems, and also it's proof that whoever Shakespeare was understood that people could communicate with the muses and draw the inspiration from those muses, which is what Homer mentions. So that's very, very interesting. And also the other sonnet, which thing is Sonnet 144, "Two loves I have of comfort and despair." Now this is a very interesting one, because there's a lot of experts say, it's about a gay relationship, or man and young woman, whatever. But basically, to me, the key line in this is, "Two loves I've comfort and despair." The key line is this: "And whether my angel be turned fiend, suspect I may, yet not directly tell, but both being from me." That is the key. That is the key. Both to each friend, I guess one angel and another's hell, yet this I shall never know, but live in doubt till my bad angel fire my good one out. And that is about the good and the bad of the mind. There's no question about that. That is receiving information, good and bad, and that has nothing to do with any gay relationship. There's nothing to do with a man and a woman. That is about the things that's going on in your own head.
Yes, I mean, it's a very obvious line there, isn't it? Saying both being from me. Well, you can't get much clearer than that, can you?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, so I think, when you're talking about the Shakespeare conundrum and everything, and about, who wrote the works, and you've got a number of people. I mean, they even said Queen Elizabeth wrote it, because but there's so many. There's so many saying, well, it's obvious. I mean, it's obvious to me that you don't get the knowledge to write on 30 different subjects, do you? Quite honestly.
Well, I mean, I've seen it said by the Stratfordians that he met lots of different people, and he did have a bit of time at court and blah blah blah. But I think to be so precise, because he had very precise navigational and sailing terms within the works.
Yeah.
You would have to have a working knowledge
of foreign languages as well, falconry,
and to know subjects that would be for aristocratic people. And I do know that obviously his mother had some sort of connections back to Norman times with aristocracy, but because she married John, I think that she wouldn't really have been held in huge esteem from that. Although John Shakespeare was at one point mayor, I think, of Stratford, wasn't he?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. I mean.
Oh, and he was chief beer taster, I think, as well, wasn't he, at one point?
Well, I think I read somewhere that they did have a brewery. I mean, I'm sure I read it that it was in.
Well, they were definitely involved in grain, that's for sure.
Oh yeah, they was in.
But I mean, John Shakespeare was a glove maker, wasn't he? So I mean, that's not an aristocratic family by any means. So to have specialist knowledge on things, at court, subject matter at court, I just find it a bit difficult to get my head around it. And a man that only spent a few short years, if indeed he did go to grammar school, I think it's probable he did, because when his father became mayor, I think that it gave him the opportunity then to educate his
I
children.
mean, he made a lot of dough, didn't he? He
But
made
also,
a lot of money.
his father then fell on hard times, so he couldn't have afforded it any longer. So I think, he wouldn't have been there that long. And I find it very difficult myself on a personal basis to believe that, yes, all right, he could have been a genius, but I find it difficult for a man that could hardly scrawl his name to have written all these manuscripts and this mellifluous language in his works. From one man?
No, it's very difficult. And, I mean, if you're talking about 30 different subjects, 7 different languages, he's made up 600 plus words and completely made up. So, I mean, if you make words up, I mean, what are they supposed to mean anyway? They don't mean anything, do they? But people have managed somehow to...
They mean nothing to anyone
Well,
else
they
other
wouldn't,
than you if
but
you
they
make
know-
them up. So how would anyone understand them?
But they seem to have done a good job now. I don't know. They've, every word seems to make sense now, doesn't it? But I mean, if he made them up, well, I don't know. They didn't exist, the words, so he obviously made them up. But it is a fascinating thing. But what I can't get my head around, honestly, is why you get Baconians, Marlovians, Oxfordians, Derbyites putting their man as being the only person to have done that work. I don't understand it.
Well, I think it's the thing, isn't it? I mean, if you've got evidence, which clearly there are pieces of evidence to link all these people in it, then clearly they must in some way have all then
Have
been
been a
involved,
collaboration,
mustn't they?
And
what was the thing in the Mermaid Tavern? They used to meet in the Mermaid Tavern, some of these people as well, didn't they?
Yeah. There was a book with Tales of the Mermaid Tavern or something.
Yeah, so
But that was Ben Jonson, with his Canary Wine, wasn't it? But, as I say, I think that, it's a wonderful story to think that someone would have so much genius. It's a wonderful story, but if you look at, as we have done, we touched on Shakespeare's dodgy past and everything, and then you've got contradictory views from a lot of famous people, a lot of famous playwrights and everything about Shakespeare that talk about plagiarism and all kinds of stuff. He made an enormous amount of money, didn't he?
From his naughty enterprises.
From his naughty
His
enterprises.
tax dodging and
and
rain hoarding and
threats and everything, threat to kill someone and all this kind of stuff. And you just think, well, it's not really what we're told, is it? It's not really what we're told and people want us to believe. And then you've got Garrick who set up the old enterprise and the old business in Stratford-upon-Avon, which is lovely. It's all lovely, and thousands of people all over the world are happy to accept the standard view that one man wrote 36 plays, one man wrote 154 sonnets, one man had sublime genius. And the only thing that you can say is that there is a link to the occult. There's a link to the spiritual world. There's a link between many of them,
and Freemasonry,
between death and resurrection, and and to me, it's a most wonderful book of enlightenment. And they're trying to give you the clues right the way throughout, and for some reason, I don't know why, but for some reason, all the way along the line, we've had people challenging Shakespeare, saying it's their own man, but not wanting to tie anybody else in it, and I don't understand it. It's bizarre. It truly is bizarre.
I think the problem is as well, obviously, I mean, if you suddenly got it in your head, I found Shakespeare and it's just this person. When someone else comes along and actually says, well, hang on a second, but there's some evidence for this person, it kind of bursts the bubble somewhat, doesn't it? And you don't really want to know about that. So people, I find, in the main, not everybody, but people in the main tend to cherry pick. When they've got their candidate, they then tend to cherry pick, and any evidence that therefore comes forward afterwards, they tend to not really want to know.
Well, it becomes irrelevant, doesn't it? It becomes irrelevant, a minor detail.
I think from looking at it as a whole, I mean, we've got no axe to grind, we're just interested. We're not experts on it by any means, but we're just interested, and it's interesting to find the truth about it. There've been hundreds and hundreds of books written on Shakespeare and who the possible authors are, etc., etc. And I think that you can recognise in the works links to the Greek myths, which of course then links into the Greek mystery
Shepherds of
schools.
Arcadia.
The
Yeah.
mystery schools are very important, and I think if people delve into that, they might find some interesting things, as they possibly would with Freemasonry as well. And I know that Francis Bacon has been put forward as being a candidate for
Rosicrucianism and that,
beginning
isn't it?
Freemasonry, etc., etc. But I think the only problem with that is that a form of Freemasonry, although it may not have been called that, was already in existence, and it may have been under a different guise. But nevertheless, it's very interesting. And we got a question. It says the nondescript bust we are presented with shows no character. You'd expect to see a man with an amazing, thoughtful and wise face. Yes, a good point. And what we see is what looks like some country bumpkin with rosy cheeks.
If you're talking about that's right. But if you're talking about the original bust as well, it's terrible.
It's hardly Rodin's The Thinker, is it?
Yeah.
So and I mean, clearly you can see from the original sketches as well that it's different. The one we see and recognise as the modern bust in the church now is different to the original.
It's been changed many times. Yeah, it's been changed many times from the original one. Yeah. So if we sum it all up really, and we look at it, we say that this is just our opinion, that people can get given genius. People can get enlightened and get given genius, and people can write extraordinary works when they weren't capable of it. But as I found in my case, some great works were channeled through me. But the point of it is, if you're claiming to have written 36 plays, and you're claiming to have written 154 sonnets, and know all that knowledge, incredible genius knowledge, I'm afraid we have to look at a group.
I think so.
We have to look at a group.
I personally definitely feel that Sir Francis Bacon was heavily involved.
Oh yes, there was a School of Night as well. We mustn't forget the School of Night, which had Sir Walter Raleigh and Marlowe and a number of others, because that's very important. They were considered as atheists, but they obviously knew the truth, and that's what they've tried to get out in the works of Shakespeare. And 36, is the globe, isn't it?
Exactly, 360 degrees, exactly. So are they squaring the circle, perhaps?
Yeah. Well, if you've got any thoughts on tonight's show, we'd like to hear from them. And as I say, we've done a bit of research.
Exactly, and by no means. I mean, this is such a vast subject matter, and there is so much to look at and so many links that you could literally probably spend weeks talking about it. So I mean, we just sort of encapsulated some main points, hopefully to spur some thought, some thought on the matter, and maybe some research as well, and you might find some interesting.
So what we've done so far, we haven't rubbished Bacon, we haven't rubbished Marlowe, we haven't rubbished the Earl of Derby, we haven't rubbished the Earl of Oxford, we haven't rubbished Shakespeare, have we? We've just given
the fact he was a very naughty
He was
boy.
a very naughty boy. Yes, he was a very naughty boy. And anyway, so I think we're almost up for time, ain't we? We've not got long now, so.
Yeah, but it's interesting though, isn't it? I mean, to go quickly back to Sir Francis Bacon, though. I mean, I've heard the fact that he's supposed to have been involved in the King James Bible, and I don't know if there's any actual evidence on documents to say that he was, but I believe he was involved in it.
Yeah, I think
he was certainly very good friends with Lancelot Andrews, I believe, who was mentioned as one of the divines on there who were editing that Bible. So I think it's interesting. And is it was it Psalm 46?
Psalm 46, yeah.
And the 46th line from the start says shake, and the 46th line from the end, 46th word, sorry, from the end, says spear.
Yeah.
So we've got shake,
and with the word
spear,
cellar left out, one word left out.
Yeah. So it's very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay.
So it would suggest, being that Francis Bacon was very good friends with Lancelot Andrews, that perhaps there was some involvement. Anyway, all food for thought, and I hope you enjoyed the show.
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for listening.
Alan's Investigate, and you can check us out at www.thealansinvestigate.com. We're broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network 105.3 and 107.7 FM from the beautiful city of New Orleans, and also we're on Roku, so you can see us on the telly as well.
So,
Anyway, see you next week.
happy
Thank
searching
you.
for the
Bye.
truth. Bye.